Hello class, Dr. A.J. Smith here. This is Christian Theology, Religion 330 with Judson College. And this is our first introductory lecture. Just by way of reminder, I want to remind you to read through the syllabus and make sure you understand it. If you have any questions, contact me. But let's talk today, in today's lesson, about why we should study theology. Why is theology important? People don't like to study theology. People say theology is boring. People say theology is divisive. People say theology is a problem. Why should we study theology? I had a missions professor who said, people always ask him, why can't we just tell people about Jesus? But the moment we start talking about Jesus, we're talking about theology, because we have to talk about who Jesus is. And the question then becomes, which Jesus are you going to tell people about? So it's important for us to study theology. Here are some concrete reasons. First of all, every believer is a theologian. Whether you realize it or not, whether you think about it or not, every believer is a theologian. Our thoughts and our conceptions of God constitute theological reflection. Whatever your view or vision of God is a theological construct in your mind. Secondly, inaccurate conceptions of God constitute idolatry. We're told in the second commandment not to make images of God after our own fancy. And so to the extent that we have a false vision, a false view of God, we have an idol and we're not worshiping the true God. So every believer is a theologian. Next, every believer is called upon to defend the hope that he or she has. 1 Peter 3:14 and 15, 16 say this, "But even if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, you are blessed. And do not fear their intimidation, and do not be troubled, but sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence. And keep a good conscience, so that in the thing in which you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ will be put to shame." We are all called to the task of apologetics. Also, the day in which we live calls for well thought out theology. We face a number of problems and difficulties in today's world. We face postmodernism. And in postmodernism, everything is relative. And it is the community that determines what can be considered true for a given group. And we'll talk about this more in another lecture. We face the problem of pluralism that believes many roads lead to God and all are equally valid. And I recently looked at a survey published in the Huffington Post. And the survey indicates that the vast majority of Americans believe that anybody who tries hard and is religious, regardless of their religious views, will make their way to heaven. That's simply not what the Bible teaches. There are, within evangelicalism, certain aberrations that need to be addressed. Open theism, which is a denial of God's complete foreknowledge and sovereign control over all things, is highly problematic at a number of levels. The idea of inclusivism, the belief that a person can be saved by Christ without a personal knowledge of or faith in Christ. This cuts the very nerve of the missionary task and raises a host of questions. Annihilationism, belief that the damned will be burned up rather than suffer eternally. There are significant scriptural problems with this approach. Probationism, the belief that all those in hell will eventually suffer sufficiently for their sins and be brought into heaven. If this is possible, why was it necessary for Christ to die on the cross? Obscurantism, the belief that it is not necessary and may even be wrong to think through one's beliefs. This is the view that we really don't need to think. We really don't need to reflect on theology. We just need to believe. But God calls us to love Him with our minds as well as our hearts and our souls. And so obscurantism is not the way. Fourthly, sound theology will strengthen your ministry, whatever that may be. Whether you're just going to be a Sunday school teacher, active lay member in a church, or you're going to serve in an official capacity. Sound theology will strengthen your ministry. There is a need, a great need today for depth of thought in our preaching, in our pulpits. There is a great need for depth of apologetic reflection in our witnessing as we engage different worldviews, different religious views, and secular views alike. And there is a need for applied theology in counseling. We have a bad habit of taking psychology and baptizing it. What we need is we need some sound theological reflection in our counseling. And so these are the reasons why you should study theology.